and affordable home that allows them to thrive. Information about ways to prevent and solve homelessness is at melvilletrust.org. From the Doris Duke Foundation, which aims to support the well being of people and the planet for a more creative, equitable, and sustainable future. And from the Public Welfare Foundation, committed to advancing transformative youth and criminal justice reforms.
It's Morning Edition from NPR News. I'm Michelle Martin in Washington, D.C.
And I'm Martinez in Los Angeles, California. The death toll is climbing in Gaza as the Israeli military wages war on militants who are dug into civilian centers. According to the Ministry of Health in Gaza, more than 10,000 have died in Israel's retaliatory strikes against Hamas. The ministry says most of the dead are civilians and more than 4,000 are children. Calls for a ceasefire are mounting, but even proposals for a humanitarian pause are being rejected by the government of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Here to talk about Israel's options, we've called on former U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Ivo Dalder. Ambassador, before we even get to the possibility of either a ceasefire or humanitarian pause, can you briefly define the difference between the two?
Yes, good morning. A ceasefire is really meant to stop the fighting and to move from fighting to negotiations or at least disengagement of forces in order to end the military phase of the conflict. A pause is designed to have a temporary stop in the fighting to allow something else to happen. And we've already seen a couple of pauses in at least the Israeli fighting when hostages, 4 hostages that have been released, were moving out of Gaza and back into Israel. So one is temporary and designed to achieve something that's happening on the ground. The other is designed to be permanent and to end the military phase of the conflict.
Why do you think Israel is so opposed to the idea of even a brief pause?
Well, they are very, very worried that Hamas will exploit anything that is happening on the ground to the benefit of Hamas. It's one of the reasons it's been so hard to get humanitarian assistance in. Israel doesn't want any fuel because they fear that fuel that might be meant for generators at hospitals will actually be diverted to Hamas to allow it to fight Israel in response to Israel's into Gaza. So even pauses don't make sense. But a ceasefire, which the U.S. also does not support, would mean that the military phase of the conflict is over and Israel still has as its goal the dismantling of Hamas, which has not yet been achieved.
Now, in its October 7th attack on Israel, Hamas fighters captured more than 200 Israeli civilians and foreign nationals. If, Ambassador, the Israeli government won't consider a ceasefire or a pause until those hostages are returned, how does that square with the international conventions of war?
Well, it's force in a proportionate manner, designed to only target those who are direct combatants in the fight. And it says that doing so is consistent with the laws of war. At the same time, the collateral damage, as the military people call it, but what really means the killing of many others who are not combatants, who are civilians, that results from the kind of strikes that Israel has been conducting, is extraordinary, and indeed leading to the calls of a ceasefire and this push by the Biden administration to say, you need to really find a way to allow the war to be fought in a more discriminate way that does not necessarily affect all of these civilians, which is truly a horrific occurrence of this war.
That is veteran diplomat Ivo Dalder, a former U.S. ambassador to NATO, also president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Ambassador, thanks.
Thank you.
The maker of the popular video game Fortnite will begin a fight today with higher stakes than you will find in one of its typical online battles.
Epic Games will be in federal court in San Francisco for the beginning of an antitrust case against Google. Now, Epic claims Google has a monopoly over developers because of the way it runs its app store. The online search giant says a victory for Epic would damage a business model that has delivered lower prices for customers.
Eddie Robertson is a senior tech and policy editor for The Verge and has been following this case and is with us now to tell us more. Good morning.
Good morning.
So could you just tell us more about how Epic Games and Google got to the point where they've ended up in court?
So Epic, as mentioned, runs Fortnite, and Fortnite is a free-to-play game. It makes a lot of its money by selling virtual currency through its app. And because of that, it pays what is derided as a Google tax, which is a commission that Google takes on in-app purchases, not just for video games, but for a lot of apps, and a smaller fee for subscriptions. And so it updated its game in 2020 to add a new way of paying that offered cheaper prices to customers and didn't use Google's payment system. Google banned it from the store, and then Epic sued, saying that this was a demonstration of how Google maintains an illegal monopoly. It did the same for Apple, and there was another lawsuit that went to trial in 2021.
Yeah, tell me about that. I was thinking, I'm not an expert here, but that sounded familiar. So you're reminding us that Epic sued Apple for much the same thing. How did that work out?
That ended up in what's largely considered a victory for Apple, that the judge determined that Apple had the right to run its model. It didn't have to open up its app store, although it did have to make some changes in how it let app developers tell users about potential other ways to pay. But that case is currently going up. They're attempting to get it to the Supreme Court, so we don't know what the final outcome is going to be.
So how is this case different?
This case, in some ways, is just another attempt at another sort of bite at the same apple, although it's not Apple this time. But among other things, it's going up in front of a jury, so the arguments, instead of a judge. So the arguments could be a little bit different. They could focus a little more on just trying to sway a jury about the basic monopoly arguments here. But I think that it's still, in some ways, an uphill battle for Epic.
How come? Why do you say that?
We've seen a lot of antitrust cases over the last few years, and in a lot of cases, it's been just very difficult to make the argument that prices are getting raised or that people are getting locked out, especially when the services involved are cheap or pretty free. That a lot of these services, the tech companies involved can say, look, it's really easy to just go and switch to another website or another app store or buy another phone.
And this is big because, as briefly as you can, this is a big deal, not just for video game fans, because
if you own a phone, an Android phone especially, Epic's claim is that you're paying higher prices than you need to for things that you buy inside apps. That there are entire business models that have been harder because if you're selling a virtual good, like not just a video game purchase, but an ebook or an audiobook, then those things get slapped with this fee that's higher than Epic argues it should be. And so they're saying they want to open this up. Meanwhile, Google is saying that Android is a viable competitor to Apple because of this method they have.
That is Addie Robertson of The Verge. Addie, thank you.
Thank you.
This is NPR News.
And this is Alaska Public Media here on KSKA Anchorage. I'm Michael Finelli. Alaska broke its record for cruise ship tourism this year, with Alaska's capital city recording more than 1.6 million passengers, according to figures released at a meeting of the Juneau Chamber of Commerce. The Alaska Beacon reports that most Alaska tourists arrive via cruise ship, and Juneau sees all but a handful of the cruise ships that visit Alaska each summer, making the city's figures a proxy for the industry as a whole. The numbers mark a major rebound from the COVID-19 pandemic. Juneau's 1.3 million cruise passengers in 2019 had been the previous record. An annual survey of nearly 400 Southeast Alaska business owners also found about 3/4 of them had a positive view of the region's economy, the highest mark since the survey began in 2010. Almost 80% of survey participants said they have positive expectations for next year as well. Tourism accounts for 15% of Southeast Alaska's jobs, but only 9% of its wages. Most tourism jobs are seasonal, occurring during the cruise ship season that runs from April through October. And the sun rose just a few minutes ago at 8:40 a.m., setting at 4:40 p.m. this evening. The time right now is 8:43. You're listening to Alaska Public Media.
In the spring of 2016, a wildfire ignited in the forests of northern Alberta that would forever change the lives of the people who lived in its path. That's next time on Here and Now.
This afternoon at 3 on FM 91.1.
This portion of Morning Edition was recorded earlier for broadcast at this time.
For many about to step out the door. You've got your keys, your wallet, and NPR. If you have your smartphone, we are with you. Listen live at this station's website or npr.org. Good morning, I'm Michelle Martin. So what did you do Friday night? 120 people in Saline County, Kansas spent the night in the sheriff's new jail. The experience was billed as Slumber in the Slammer. For $20, visitors got a chance to be booked, have a mugshot taken, eat with a rubber spoon, and sleep in a cell. One participant told the local news she did not realize what people in jail had to go through. Not clear how many booked return visits, though. It's Morning Edition.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from the Pew Charitable Trusts, sharing how communities are restoring trust and solving problems on the After the Fact podcast, available at pewtrusts.org/afterthefact. From the Lodestar Foundation, inspired by the principle that helping someone else less fortunate is a path to a happier, healthier, and more meaningful life. Learn more at lodestarfoundation.org. And from listeners like you who donate to this NPR station.
This is Morning Edition from NPR News. I'm Michelle Martin.
Enemy Martinez. Food waste takes up a lot of landfill space. Turning that garbage into something good for the earth is the goal of a growing number of community composters, but not all cities welcome the effort. Harvest Public Media's Eva Tesfaye reports.
That's where owners Brooke Savaggio and Daniel Hurrier hold a scoop of what they call black gold. If you smell it, it just smells like fertility. I love it.
I mean, it just smells like really rich soil. And when we put it out on the fields, it becomes really rich soil.
That black gold is compost made from food scraps and some yard waste, either dropped off by area residents or collected by couples of their business. It helps keep those items out of landfills where they would rot and produce methane, a powerful greenhouse gas. Savaggio says the compost is improving the farm's yields. However, a few neighbors find it more of a nuisance than a benefit. They've complained to the city about bad smells and pests. The city now says the operation requires a special use permit. Hurrier says the city gave them permission to expand 2 years ago and should not be creating obstacles to manage food waste sustainably.
I want to create more compost hubs like this. Certainly the city of Kansas City should be helping us do that.
There are thousands of composting operations in the U.S., but the Institute of Local Self-Reliance says only about 300 are so-called community composters that make and use the product locally. At the Institute of Local Self-Reliance says community composting don't have updated zoning rules that address composting specifically.
Local governments can either say, oh, you've got a problem, or they can help these operations that support their communities to overcome the obstacles.
In the past 6 years, the number of community composters in the United States more than doubled. Most are in New York and California. They're also on the rise in the Midwest, but it's much less of a priority, says Jennifer Trent. She's a program manager at the University of Northern Iowa's Waste Reduction Center.
A lot of times it's a preconceived idea or notion that compost sites are foul places and that they won't be beneficial to the community.
She says composting is not a nuisance if it's done right, and bad smells can be reduced, even in outdoor operations, by combining the materials in a specific way.
If you have a compost site that's not complying with the regulations, enforce those laws. Don't allow them to continue until it's fixed.
The U.S. Composting Council says having good zoning laws, enforcing them, and educating residents about composting helps make sure everything runs smoothly. When Ben Stanger wanted to start his business, Greenbox Compost, in Wisconsin, a lot of municipalities told him no. But he says officials in Sun Prairie, a suburb near Wisconsin's state capital, were willing to change a zoning code for his business.
It just happened to be that Sun Prairie, really rolled out the welcome mat and helped us kind of work through this.
Stanger is composting indoors with containers to prevent nuisances, and the city is also doing its part by educating residents, says Jake King, a spokesperson for Sun Prairie.
we really try to look at that public outreach and engagement so people know what we're doing and most importantly know why we're doing it.
That's the challenge for many cities, figuring out how to battle climate change and manage waste in ways that residents will embrace. For NPR News, I'm Eva Tesfaye in Kansas City.
This is Morning Edition from NPR News. I'm Martinez.
And I'm Michelle Martin. I'm Michael Finelli, and you are listening to Alaska Public Media here on KSKA Anchorage. It's currently 8:49 on this Monday morning, November the 6th, and it is 29 degrees with some light snow and fog over at the Anchorage International Airport. 24 degrees on the hillside this morning, up to 29 in northeast Anchorage, 26 in Eagle River, 33 and overcast up to Matsu, and 30 degrees with snow showers over in Northwood. The forecast for the Anchorage Bowl, snow likely to continue this morning, otherwise cloudy with highs in the low 30s. Overnight lows tonight in the mid-20s. It'll be mostly sunny tomorrow. And after setting our clocks back an hour yesterday, the sun rose this morning at 8:40 a.m. and it'll set at 4:44 p.m. It gives us about 8 hours and 3 minutes of daylight today. That's a difference of 5 minutes, 22 seconds from yesterday. That's Alaska Public Media.
This is Alaska Public Media on KSKA FM 19 Alaska. Life.
The state of Alaska is hosting a discussion on behavioral health services for children and youth. Those living in South Central can join to share your experiences accessing behavioral health services for children and youth. Participate in person at the Matsu Health Foundation or online, Wednesday, November 8th at 6 p.m. Registration and information at b8group.alaska.gov. This message is sponsored by the state of Alaska.
Morning Edition. Earlier, podcast at
Place for unfair to players.
Marketplace Report is supported by Amazon Business, helping provide a smarter, easier way to get the supplies businesses need to thrive. Amazon Business, partner for smart business money. And by Fidelity, a dedicated Fidelity advisor can help create a wealth plan for a full financial picture. Investment that will supply. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC.
I'm David Brancaccio in New York. What can we learn about money, markets, and business from the huge video game industry? We call our project here Skin in the Game. Today, a lesson from the headlines on antitrust. A civil trial is set to start today, pitting video game maker Epic against Google. A jury in San Francisco will decide whether Google's App Store uses monopoly power to unfairly drive up prices for app developers and game players.
If this case sounds familiar, it's because Epic sued Apple over similar claims. The video game maker says both the iOS and Android mobile operating systems coerce users of Epic's popular Fortnite game to make in-app purchases through Apple's and Google's payment system, ensuring the tech giants get a cut of revenues. Epic wants to be able to include an alternative payment method that bypasses Apple's and Google's transaction fees. For the most part, Epic lost its battle against Apple, and both sides are appealing. Now it's Google's turn, and ahead of the trial, the company agreed to settle with other plaintiffs who were involved, 50 states, the District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico, as well as Match Group, the operator of dating apps. Will pay Match $40 million to get access to its so-called user choice billing system announced last year. Through that system, Google charges a lower service fee. Epic has dismissed that option, saying it still allows Google to tax transactions. I'm Novasafo for Marketplace.
The House of Representatives is expected to vote on its transportation funding bill this week. Now, that vote was postponed last week after protests. It cuts too much money from Amtrak.
The legislation would fund the Departments of Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development. It's one of 12 funding bills Congress needs to pass and the president needs to sign to fund the federal government each year. But the House version of the bill would cut Amtrak funding by about $1 billion. The White House says the proposed cuts would force Amtrak to reduce most of its long-distance rail service, run fewer trains along the popular Northeast Corridor, and scale back or postpone almost 400 capital projects. In September, a group of House Republicans signed on to a letter to then House Speaker Kevin McCarthy protesting the cuts to Amtrak. The letter says Amtrak needs to be fully funded so it can rebuild bridges and tunnels, invest in stations and route improvements, and replace aging trains. As is, the House bill is unlikely to pass the Senate, and even if it did, it would be vetoed by President Biden. I'm Nancy Marshall-Genzer for Marketplace.
I see the Dow is up 20 points now, the S&P up 0.2%, the NASDAQ is up 0.4%. And during this time of year for picking benefits during open enrollment at work, we look at menopause benefits. That story is streamable from our homepage if you missed it on the air today.
Marketplace Morning Report is supported by Odoo, provider of an all-in-one management platform with a suite of fully integrated applications designed to simplify and connect every aspect of business in one software. More at odoo.com. And by Schwab. Schwab offers investors choices like full-service wealth management, self-directed investing options, and trading on Thinkorswim. More at schwab.com. And by C3 AI. C3 Generative AI provides ChatGPT enterprise search that is verifiable, secure, and accurate across all enterprise data. C3.ai. This is enterprise AI.
It happened as September is the month, turned to October. The U.S. drove off what some call child care cliff, the deadline for child care providers to spend $37 million in federal pandemic-era subsidies. Now that the money is done, there's a forecast that thousands of child care programs will close. Here's Marketplace's Stephanie Hughes.
It's lunchtime at downtown Baltimore Child Care, and the preschoolers are getting ready for a race.
Oh, you want to have a milk race with me?
To see who can drink their milk first.
Let's go for it.
The kids and teacher Ebony Goins all down their cups.
My bones are now strong.
Goins is one of 85 teachers here. The organization prides itself on having one teacher every 7 preschoolers. That allows for fun activities like that milk race. Downtown Baltimore Child Care received just over $1 million in federal pandemic relief funds. Some of that bought gloves and bleach, but the vast majority went towards paying those teachers.
It was very important for us to keep all of our employees in jobs and in health benefits.
Executive Director Hillary Roberts King says now that the federal money is gone, she's fundraising and applying for grants. She's also keeping an eye on costs, putting off replacing the windows, for instance, and giving smaller raises than she would have liked.
This past year, we had to do 4% for people who make less and 2% for people who make more, and it wasn't great news.
The employees here make at least $15 an hour, which is more than $1 over the median wage for childcare workers across the country. Still, Roberts King says having less money to pay employees affects her ability to hire. It also affects current staff members.
You know, it's just the pay in this career is not enough.
Tiffany Thornton is a teacher with downtown Baltimore Child Care. She loves the work, but says she still has to supplement her income.
I've been here 20 years and I still do side jobs. Like I babysit on the side. I do Instacart on the side.
Thornton has held off having kids of her own. She's worried she wouldn't be able to afford it. She's 39.
You know, I don't have a lot of time to figure that out. You know, I'm getting older, but no, I don't have kids. And that's one of the reasons why childcare is expensive. The pay doesn't match, the economy right now.
Thornton says she'll stick with the job because she is at her core an early childhood educator. But others have left the industry. There's more than 38,000 fewer childcare providers now than in February 2020. In Baltimore, I'm Stephanie Hughes for Marketplace.
And there are still unsettling messages on the sites and apps of many banks this morning after some kind of glitch at the private system that processes direct deposits known as TCH, the clearinghouse. It affected some payments this past Friday, November 3rd. Banks have promised to sort it all out. For instance, Bank of America's app this morning is still warning that some deposits may be temporarily delayed, but that accounts are secure and the balance will be updated. However, customers want to know that no other checks bounced or credit scores affected because of this. We are monitoring. In New York, I'm David Brancaccio, Marketplace Morning Report. From APM.
Everything is a possible target for a cyber attack these days. Even the family farm.
Oh, that's real creepy. They can make your $500,000 piece of equipment a paperweight by pushing a button.
I'm Dina Temple-Raston. That's next time on our special series, Click Here. Tech stories you don't need to be a techie to understand.
Monday at 10 a.m., repeating at 8 p.m. on FM 91.1.
It may be possible to double your donation to Alaska Public Media at no additional cost to you. Check whether your employer will match your gift at alaskapublic.org/matching.
You're listening to KSKA Anchorage, also translating as K220AL Girdwood, K216BN Prudhoe Bay, and K261EI Anchorage.
Funding for Here and Now comes from MathWorks, creators of MATLAB and Simulink software, accelerating the pace of engineering and science. Learn more at mathworks.com.
From NPR and WBUR Boston, I'm Peter O'Dowd.
And I'm Scott Tong. This is Here and Now. Coming up, the latest from New York as former President Trump takes the stand in the civil case brought against him by the state.
Also, in 2016, a wildfire in northern Alberta turned 2,500 homes to ash and gave us a hint of what's to come.
We haven't seen what climate change has in store for us in the 21st century.
And we hear music from the Sambagitas, a musical trio that sings songs in Tagalog, the language of the Philippines.
It's a way for us to connect back to our roots, kind of like this current that brings us home to where our ancestors are from.
Coming up Here and Now.
First, the news.
This is National Native News. I'm Antonia Gonzalez. A federal commission has issued its recommendations to help tribal communities, federal agencies, and law enforcement to respond to missing and murdered Indigenous people. Montana Public Radio's Aaron Bolton has more.
According to federal crime data, American Indians and Alaska Natives go missing or are murdered at higher rates than their white counterparts. Many cases go unsolved. Congress passed the Not Invisible Act in 2020. The bill formed a federal commission made up of tribal leaders, federal agencies, families, and survivors. The commission held several hearings across the country to get input from tribal communities. The commission issued numerous recommendations. It called for more federal funding for tribal police and changes to federal laws that limit tribal police investigations. It also called for more training and collaboration between tribal, state, and federal law enforcement agencies. Federal agencies have 90 days to respond to the Commission's recommendations. In Columbia Falls, I'm Aaron Bolton.
A new report from Canada's Corrections Watchdog says there are still too many Indigenous people in the country's prisons. Dan Karpachuk reports.
Correctional investigator Ivan Zinger says over the past decade, the problem has become significantly worse. In his latest report, Zinger says 32% of all federal inmates across the country, as well as 50% of the women, are Indigenous. That's compared to 25% 10 years ago. And he says the system still bears many of the lingering hallmarks of colonialism, which, Zinger adds, contributes to the marginalization, criminalization, and over-imprisonment of Indigenous people in Canada.
The discriminatory treatment of Indigenous persons in federal custody was among the first set of issues raised by my office when it was created 50 years ago. In the decades that follow, my office has issued more than 70 recommendations specific to Indigenous corrections. Sadly, most of these calls have gone unanswered.
And Zinger says the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in federal custody continues to widen.
It is difficult to escape the conclusion that the correctional system perpetuates conditions of disadvantage and discrimination that contributes to such a disproportional incarceration rate.
In his report, Zinger urges the transfer of federal operated healing lodges to local authorities. He is also calling for a national strategy of Indigenous decarceration and better support for Indigenous elders who work within the correctional system. For National Native News, I'm Dan Karpinchuk.
The Coquille tribe says it's landed one of the biggest competitive grants ever in its history. KLCC's Brian Bull reports on the nearly $8 million from the U.S. Department of Transportation.
The money will fund 3 phases of improvements to the Coquille Wharf near the tribe's Mill Casino Hotel in North Bend. In short, dock repairs will be made to sections which have seen little or no work in 40 years. A 600 to 700 foot extension will be added as well. Ray Doring, the project manager for the wharf, says the final piece is making electrical service available to large ships that dock there.
What a lot of ports are doing now, and we're certainly one of them, is providing electricity in heavy enough volume that they can turn off their diesel engines and connect to electricity here on the dock face. It'll be a lot cheaper, and it's a huge environmental improvement.
Doring is with Tribal One, an organization that helps the Coquille tribe with economic development. He says there's potential in overseas commerce that this wharf improvement will support. For National Native News, I'm Brian Bull.
And I'm Antonia Gonzalez.
National Native News is produced by Koahnic Broadcast Corporation with funding by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Scoop Dutch, support by Ramona Farms. For over 40 years, Ramona's American Indian Foods has revived peppery beans, pinole, traditional wheat flours, and more. Delivery for your holiday gatherings available on orders placed at store.ramonafarms.com. Dongyon. Support by Vision Maker Media, envisioning a world changed and healed by understanding Native stories and the public conversations they generate. 45 plus years of Native stories and Indigenous knowledge through film and media can be found at visionmakermedia.org.
Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.
Cyrano's Theater Company presents Tartuffe, Moliere's celebrated comic romp of hilarious wordplay and flirty antics. Tartuffe has conned his way into the home of Orgon, pretending to be a holy man, as he cons the oblivious and wealthy patron who adores him to marry his daughter, seduce his wife, and steal all his money. November 17th through December 10th, Thursday through Sunday. Tickets available through CenterTix and at Cyranos.org. This message sponsored by Cyrano's Theater Company.
From NPR and WBUR, I'm Scott Tong in Washington, D.C.
I'm Peter O'Dowd in Phoenix. This is Here and Now. Israel's military says it struck 450 targets in Gaza overnight and has encircled Gaza City with ground troops. Israel says Gaza City is the center for military operations of Hamas, but it's also home to hundreds of thousands of civilians, and it is still unclear how many are stuck there.
To limit the casualties, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken conducted a whirlwind secret diplomatic trip over the weekend to Israel, Jordan, the West Bank, Iraq, and today to Turkey. In Israel, he urged a pause in fighting to get injured Palestinians out, to retrieve Israeli hostages, and to bring out U.S. citizens.
We believe that each of these efforts would be facilitated by humanitarian pauses, by arrangements on the ground that increase security for civilians and permit the more effective and sustained delivery of humanitarian assistance.
Now, Blinken does face a balancing act. He spoke against a complete ceasefire with Arab leaders in Jordan Saturday.
It's our view that a ceasefire now would simply leave Hamas in place, able to regroup and repeat what it did on October 7th.
Let's bring in NPR's Michelle Kellerman at the State Department. Hi, Michelle.
Hi, Scott.
What is the distinction Antony Blinken is trying to make here? Yes to a pause, no to a ceasefire?
Yeah, I mean, what they're talking about is pauses to get aid in and for Americans and other foreign nationals to get out of Gaza through the Rafah border crossing across into Egypt. And even getting these short-term pauses has been a challenge. Secretary Blinken says Israel has raised some questions about how this is going to work. David Satterfield, who's a U.S. diplomat who was brought out of retirement to work with Israel on this, is still there trying to hammer out some of these things. And the other thing they're working on, Scott, is the U.S. is very focused on those hostages that were taken from Israel to Gaza when all of this began on October 7th.
Yeah, and tell us more about the hostages and what the U.S. is doing.
So Qatar seems to be playing kind of the biggest role behind the scenes on that. 2 Americans, you might remember, were released a couple of weeks ago under a deal that was mediated by Qatar. And what the U.S. is hoping to do is to replicate that on a much larger scale. But that is going to require a much longer pause than the fighting. So we'll see, how that can happen. I mean, there are more than 200 hostages, including some Americans and other foreign nationals that have been held by Hamas.
As far as the question on pause, the reporting suggests the answer was no from the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He said a pause would only happen if Israeli hostages are released. Was that answer kind of expected?
Well, I think that's part of this. I mean, what they're talking about are these short-term pauses for aid, but then a much longer-term pause for the hostage deal. All of this is still being negotiated. It is very complicated. There are a lot of players here. And, it's hard to know who has the most sway with Hamas.
Yeah. Blinken, of course, also went to the West Bank over the weekend, met with Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas. Many Arab leaders criticized the current reality, demanding a ceasefire. So for the U.S. here, is there any sign of a middle ground?
Well, I mean, what he's trying to do is get countries in the region to start thinking about the day after. Who's going to run Gaza after this war is over? The Palestinian Authority is weak. That's a big concern. He's also pushing the Israelis to rein in Israeli settler violence against Palestinians of the West Bank. And on that, Arab countries agree with him and would like to see him do more. But at least in public, they are very much focused, not as much on the day after, but on the here and now and just how the devastating civilian toll in Israel's campaign against Hamas. Arab leaders were quite open with Blinken about that. They called this collective punishment against the Palestinians. And Jordan's foreign minister warned, these were his words, he said that the whole region is sinking in a sea of hatred that will define generations to come.
Now, on this trip, the Secretary of State was met by protesters expressing outrage over the war in Gaza. In the U.S., tens of thousands of people demonstrated in D.C., in New York, Nashville, Cincinnati, on behalf of the Palestinians in Gaza. Is that putting a certain pressure on the White House?
It is, but he keeps reminding those who oppose the U.S. position about what Hamas did to Israelis on October 7th. He says it may have receded in the minds for some, but he says no country could accept what he called the slaughter of its civilians and do nothing about it. The Biden administration says it is telling Israel that the way it wages this fight against Hamas matters, but the U.S. supports the goal of making sure that Hamas no longer controls Gaza or is able to carry out attacks like it did on October 7th. So that's the walking the fine line, and it doesn't seem to be changing.
Yeah. NPR's Michelle Kellerman at the State Department. Michelle, thanks as always.
Thank you.
In a New York City courtroom today, Donald Trump has taken a combative stance against the judge overseeing a $250 million civil fraud case against the former president. New York Attorney General Letitia James has accused Trump of falsifying the value of Trump Organization assets to get better deals on bank loans and insurance. Here's Trump before entering the courtroom today after repeatedly calling the case unfair.
We will go along and we will hopefully do very well in every regard. We'll win the election and we'll make America great again. That's what we're going to do. We're going to make America great again.
Trump's tone got more tense once he went inside the courtroom and took the stand. NPR's Jimena Bustillo is covering the trial. She joins us now. Jimena, welcome.
Hi there.
So this is the first time the former president has officially been on the stand to address the allegations in one of the many cases against him. You've been in the courthouse today. What kind of fireworks did you hear between Trump and the judge?
Well, even during the first hour, there were some tense exchanges between the judge and Trump's legal team. Judge Engoron at one point saying that he was beseeching the Trump team to, quote, control him on the stand. He felt that Trump was going on long speeches and tangents that included additional comments, not only about his property, that hand that he was being questioned on, but his own political current process. As we know, he's running for president. vying for the GOP nomination, but also how he thought the judge was politically motivated and how he thought the attorney general who brought this lawsuit against him is, quote, a hack. Now, Engoron seems to have no patience with this, and the Trump team argued that the nature of this case and being that Trump is the front runner for the GOP nomination and there is no jury should warrant longer answers, perhaps more than what the judge wants.
So Trump and his co-defendants, which include his sons, they've already been found liable for fraud, which means this is a trial to determine the penalty. The Attorney General, Letitia James, wants a permanent ban on Trump doing business in New York, plus that $250 million fine. How has the prosecution tried to prove its case thus far, and what are we seeing today?
Well, just a quick clarification. It has been found that fraud was committed, but there is still the question of whether or not they are liable for that fraud, meaning whether or not they did it on purpose or there was that conspiracy to commit it. And so the way that the Attorney General has kind of gone about this is bringing up various witnesses who work within the Trump organization or the accounting firm Mazars to generally ask about how these documents were created. And this includes literal math. We've stared at a lot of spreadsheets, but it also includes a hierarchy and power influence within the Trump organization that may have led to numbers being crunched in a certain way or another. Ultimately, Trump, including his sons as well as he himself, are signed as responsible for a lot of these statements, meaning that even if they didn't do the number crunching themselves, they could still be liable for, any fraud or misleading information that could keep them.
Eric Trump and Don Jr. Testified last week in the case. His daughter, the former president's daughter, Ivanka Trump, is scheduled to testify on Wednesday. And of course, Donald Trump has already given 2 depositions in this case. How is all the testimony we've heard so far affecting the trial?
Well, he said back then, as well as what he's saying now, which is primarily he thinks his properties are undervalued, even with the inflated numbers that we have seen. And he says that while he never had a handle on the documents himself, he relied on others to make them. And that's something we heard out of both Don Jr. and Eric's testimony as well. They said that they trusted accountants working for Mazars, or they trusted other folks within the Trump organization to know what they were doing to create the full numbers. But he's also leaning on arguments such as there's disclaimer clauses that warn buyers to do their own due diligence, as well as falling back on usual political motivations and kind of this idea that this trial is a witch hunt, which we heard out of his depositions and we're hearing again on the stand.
Yeah, and as I said at the start here, this may not be the last time we see the former president on the stand. How does this testimony provide any clues to what he might do or how he might handle the 4 criminal trials that he's facing next year?
Well, he definitely is digging his heels in on any argument that he has made publicly. And this is one key thing about Donald Trump is he has been coming out and talking to reporters. He did so this morning before the trial. He didn't in between breaks. However, he has been every day that he's been coming to court. Everything he says in public is also what he's saying in this trial. And the interesting thing about this trial is it's not televised like others might be. That's very much up to the judge. But he isn't saying anything new. He isn't saying anything completely groundbreaking or anything that he hasn't said in public before.
NPR reporter Jimena Bustillo covering former President Donald Trump's civil fraud trial in New York. He is taking the stand today. Jimena, thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's Here and Now.
Years ago, a former detective set out to track down an uncle who had been missing for decades.
It says the date of death was July 19th, 2020, which would have made Uncle Caesar 64 years old. And it says place of disposition is City Cemetery at Hart Island.
We continue the Unmarked Graveyard series on the next All Things Considered from NPR News.
I'm Steve Brown. Israeli forces have severed northern Gaza from the rest of the besieged territory and pounded it with intense airstrikes overnight, setting the stage for an expected push into the dense confines of Gaza City. Already, the Palestinian death toll passed 10,000, according to the health ministry in Hamas-run Gaza. Aid is trickling into villages in Nepal's mountainous northwest, hit by a strong earthquake over the weekend. Survivors have been searching through the rubble of their collapsed homes to salvage what was left of their belongings. The quake, late on Friday, killed at least 157 people and injured 256, leaving thousands homeless. Britain's Prince William says 7 countries have committed at a wildlife summit to deepen their intelligence sharing to combat money laundering by international gangs engaged in the illegal wildlife trade. You're listening to Here and Now.
Hi, this is the Newsroom's digital managing editor, Tegan Hanlon. You're listening to Alaska Public Media on KSKA Anchorage, FM 91.1.
The state of Alaska is hosting a discussion on behavioral health services for children and youth. Those living in South Central can join to share your experiences accessing behavioral health services for children and youth. Participate in person at the Matsu Health Foundation or online. Wednesday, November 8th at 6 p.m. Registration and information at bhroadmap.alaska.gov. This message sponsored by the state of Alaska. Support for Alaska Public Media comes from donors like you and from the Westmark Fairbanks Hotel and Conference Center, located in downtown Fairbanks, featuring hot breakfast, Wi-Fi, and a fitness center. Reservations at westmarkhotels.com.
Funding for Here and Now comes from the listeners of WBUR Boston and Staples, with supplies and services to get business done no matter where it gets done, from ink and toner cartridges to technology like laptops and networking accessories. More at Staples stores or staples.com.
This is Here and Now. In the spring of 2016, a wildfire ignited in the forest of northern Alberta, Canada, that would forever change the lives of the people who lived in its path. Here's a reporter for Global News standing along the highway of Fort McMurray as the forests boil over with fire and threatens a line of cars that's trying to evacuate the city.
Look at that. Like that, even in the past 5 minutes, has just flared up. And to be honest, I'm not sure how long we'll be able to stay here, but it shows how quickly things are changing.
Though miraculously no one died as a result of the flames, 2,500 homes and other structures were destroyed, thousands more were damaged, and the fire would burn through the desiccated forests of Canada for more than a year. John Valiant wrote a book about the fire. It is a finalist for this year's National Book Award for Nonfiction. It's called Fire Weather, a true story from a hotter world. John Valiant, welcome to Here and Now, and congratulations.
Peter, thank you. It's great to be with you.
It's great to have you. And Fort McMurray, let's start there. It was a boom town, the epitome of a boom town, built on the incredible wealth of Alberta's tar sands industry. Tell me about Fort McMurray and why it was even there in the first place.
Yeah, it's an anomaly in North America. It's 600 miles north of the U.S. border, basically buried in the boreal forest. And it's an isolated bitumen, which is tar, refining and recovery project. What's extraordinary about it, it employs about 90,000 people. And in 2016, when the fire broke out, the median household income in that town was $200,000 a year.
It was wealthy. It was also no stranger to forest fire, I understand. It is common in this part of the world, just not fires like the ones that showed up in early May.
Yeah, I mean, what we're seeing happening in the boreal, which is the largest forest system on Earth, is it's been slowly drying out. Temperature on May 3rd, 2016, when the fire broke out, was over 90 degrees. Even scarier, really, was the relative humidity, which was 11%. And Peter, you have to go to Death Valley to find comparable relative humidity. And that combination of rock bottom humidity and high temperatures creates explosive conditions for fire.
In the early... From Fire Chief Darby Allen, who actually was somewhat about avoiding disaster. Here he is briefing reporters.
I'm more encouraged today that maybe it won't hit town. But yesterday we were pretty confident it was coming, and that's why we evacuated those people. And the slightest sign that we see that people are in jeopardy and safety, we will evacuate again.
So no one, I mean, not even the fire officials expected this level of destruction that was to Can you talk about how unprepared people were really for what was about to happen?
It is baffling to me because the meteorologists did a perfect job. They forecasted the conditions going back 6 months. In fact, it was understood that 2016, because of El Nino, was going to be a brutal year for fire. They had it right several days out when they predicted the temperatures and dryness. And honestly, they had it 12 hours out when they predicted a wind shift toward town at lunchtime on the 3rd. Given the explosive conditions, it would have been clear to anybody familiar with 21st century boreal fire that embers would be able to drive across virtually any barrier firefighters put in its way.
So why were the blindfolds on? I mean, you even write about someone going to drop off their dry cleaning as the flames are licking at the houses around them. I mean, why weren't people able to see the danger?
This is a kind of cognitive glitch in Homo sapiens, Peter, that is going to put us on the back foot through all our responses to climate change. We base our responses on what we've already seen, what we've already dealt with. We haven't seen what climate change has in store for us in the 21st century. And so Fort McMurray, a very can-do, wealthy, as you know, effective, young, energetic town, you know, a true boom town in every sense, I think they really saw themselves as inviolable. You know, we've dealt with fires before, we can handle this, we got this. And the fact is, no, you don't, and no, we don't.
Well, in fact, that was sort of the emotion that was going through Darby Allin's voice 2 days after that original piece of sound I played. Here he is speaking again, this time at the CDC. At this point, you could barely look at the camera when he described what happened in the town.
I would say it's been the worst day of my career. And I am, you know, the whole... The people here are devastated. Everyone's devastated.
How outmatched were the firefighters trying to?
They were totally outmatched. There wasn't one house on fire or 10 houses on fire. There were 50 houses on fire. And the radiant heat projecting off that wall of flame was about 1,000 degrees. So that's hotter than Venus. So all they could do was try to gather up as many people as they could and escape out of these burning neighborhoods.
You've used the phrase in our conversation, and you wrote about this several times in the book, a 21st century fire. In other words, this is the kind of fire that we're seeing now erupt across the western United States, across Canada, Australia. This is something that we have never seen before. Why did you come back to that phrase so often? And I wonder what it means to you.
I came back to it because all the evidence points to it. You know, what we see starting around 2000, which is when most climate scientists predicted we would start seeing noticeable changes in our atmosphere, is changes in fire behavior. And so one graphic example are these urban firestorms that previously were anomalies. You know, they've had them in California, they've had them in Australia through the 20th century, but these occurred decades apart. Starting around 2000, in Canada, these fires became more common. And then through the 2010s, Australia, you know, there was Black Saturday in 2009, and then there was the
fire tornadoes, right?
Exactly. There are these markers to me of what 21st century fire is, and one of those would be actual fire tornadoes, which are distinct from fire whirls, which are common in wildfires. But a fire tornado is an EF3 rated, home-destroying, landscape-altering event. Another example would be pyrocumulonimbus fire clouds, and these are stratosphere-piercing systems that function almost like hurricanes in the sense of the way they turn and the way they perpetuate themselves by drawing in energy from the burning landscape. These generate their own lightning. They can start fires 20 miles away from the epicenter of the fire. They're essentially self-perpetuation machines of flame that can work their way across the landscape as long as the heat and fuel holds up.
That's just terrifying. And if we go back to Fort McMurray for a moment, there's an irony here, isn't there? The fossil fuel industry built this town, but also kind of helped destroy it by pumping decades of CO2 into the atmosphere. I mean, the houses that you described were full of furniture and countertops and carpets, all built with oil-based products. All of our houses have those things in them, right? I mean, and you remind us that the oil companies, they have been well aware of the problem that fossil fuels created for the environment for many, many years. So how did the people of Fort McMurray reflect on those connections, or did they at all?
They are effectively in denial. Their conservative government is in denial. They will not discuss climate change or the petroleum industry's relationship to it because they are essentially captive to it. And what we really need to understand is that the petroleum industry is, in essence, a fire industry. That's why we recover these substances from the ground, is to burn them. And so that means it's a CO2 industry, which means it's a climate changing industry. And so for Fort McMurray to confront that would mean to radically alter their whole reason for being.
And yet 7 years after the fire, the oil and gas industry is under tremendous pressure to adapt to this changing, greener economy. So, I mean, what happened to Fort McMurray in the years since this fire, and what do you think is ahead for them?
Fort McMurray is trying to ride this gravy train as long as it can. There is undeniably a massive energy transition underway around the world. I mean, even Texas, a very close ally to Alberta. Alberta is basically the Texas of Canada. Texas is embracing renewable energy with steel, you could say. And they actually tried to invest in Alberta, and Alberta has currently a moratorium on all new green energy projects.
Before we let you go, I want to give you some credit for some absolutely beautiful poetic writing, especially about the fire itself. You often suggest, I think, that the flames appear to be alive in some mysterious way. How did your understanding of fire change?
It's cardinal sin to anthropomorphize non-human entities, but the fact is, fire behaves in a very lively way. It's not alive in the sense of being sentient, but the only reason we're alive is because we breathe and oxidize oxygen. Fire exists for exactly the same reason. And so we have a close affinity with fire, not unlike our affinity for dogs. We domesticated this wild energy and brought it into our homes. And that is profound. It has enormous implications for our future. And petroleum is this kind of quantum leap, this extraordinary Promethean advance in our control of fire, or our illusion of control of it. It's significant, I think, and important to understand how intimate we are with it and how like us it is in certain respects.
The book is called Fire, a True Story of the World. It is the finalist for this year's National Nonfiction. Thank you very much for speaking with us.
It was my pleasure.
We'll have an excerpt from the book written out.
You're listening to Alaska Public Media on Anchorage. Connecting to Alaska, life informed. The Association of Fundraising Professionals Alaska Chapter invites you to the 2023 Philanthropy Day Luncheon and Conference on Friday, November 17th. Nonprofit board members, leaders, and development professionals can hone their fundraising skills with sessions from national speakers Lynn Wester and Angela Johns, as well as Alaskan experts, including presentations on fundraising events, acknowledgement, storytelling, and more. Email afpalaskachapter@gmail.com for registration information. This is sponsored by AFP Alaska. Support for Alaska Public Media comes from sustaining efforts and from associates providing system analysis, software engineering, and project management in Alaska for over 30 years. Boston.com. Studio by Craft Carpet One with a Kiva showroom featuring and bathroom 1920 West Diamond Boulevard. Craftstudio.com. And now, of WBOR and simulation software for computing and math-based design. MathWorks, accelerating the pace of discovery and engineering and science. Learn more at BetterHelp.com. BetterHelp, committed to mental health and therapy. Clients are matched with one of 25,000 therapists and can communicate with video, chat, or phone at BetterHelp.com/public.
It's here and now. Right now, you may be one of millions of Americans squinting at the computer, trying to figure out what care plan will best suit your family. That's because it's open enrollment time for many employers, and there's a short window to choose a coverage plan for next year. Now, it might be tempting to stick with last year's plan for simplicity's sake, but our next guest says that might not be in your best interest. Jill Schlesinger is CBS News business analyst and host of Jill on Money. Jill, come on in.
Hello.
Hi there. So, look, I admit I'm one of those people who spent about 5 seconds last week thinking about changing my health insurance plan. Current plan is still working for you?
Well, I think you should just start by creating a list of your doctors and your prescriptions and just see whether everything's still covered as it was in this year in 2023. If not, that's a pretty good prompt to start moving on. But I would also be very aware of the fact that many more company plans, and remember, 153 million Americans get their health insurance through their employers. Many more employers are expanding their plans. And I would really start looking pretty hard at something called a high deductible health plan. This is what it sounds like. There's a high deductible. And you say, wow, why would I want that? Because in exchange for that higher deductible, you get lower premiums. These plans are paired with something called a health savings account. I'm just going to say this again, a health savings account, different than a flexible spending account. These accounts are fantastic, really. They are triple tax advantaged. What do I mean? The money that you put into this account, it's a pre-tax dollar. The money can grow without any taxation. When you pull the money out to pay for an unreimbursed expense, your actual deductible, there's no tax due. And these plans, unlike flexible spending accounts, are with you. You can take them to your next place in life. You can take them into retirement. They're amazing.
If your deductible is really high, if that's what you choose in this case that you just laid out, would you only recommend that for folks who are either younger or, they know they're in really good health?
It's interesting because the younger people are definitely adopting these. But I will tell you that I'm hearing from many of you who say, wait, and I can use it in good life. Starting to really adopt the high deductible health plan with the health savings account because of the flexibility and the tax advantages.
Jill Schlesinger, CBS News business analyst, host of Jill on Money. Always a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Here and now.
In some parts of the country, juvenile crime is making headlines.
A new era. Someone. So we all need to step up, all of us together.
How can you keep kids from getting into trouble and good stuff? Our series on juvenile justice continues on the next edition from NPR News. This is bird note. Scientists can now forecast bird migration based on weather and how it affects bird flight. But weather isn't the whole story. Habitats on the ground also influence the birds' journeys, says PhD student Pico Jimenez.
If there's forest cover or if there's a city, that's going to really impact where birds are taking off from, where they're flying, where they're going to land.
The migration forecast model to improve it. And they're using machine learning to come together all these different machine learning to find patterns in huge amounts of data much faster than a person can, and then use those patterns to make predictions. Even if it's not as simple as computers to the
It's really important to make this point that learning is making these huge advances. There's also people that are behind all of those important milestones that we've hit.
What is the chance to solve complex problems that until recently were out of reach.
It feels like everyone's kind of working on this huge big puzzle in their own set. Where we're trying to put these big sectors together and figure out.
More about tools on our website, birdnote.org. I'm Ariana Rebel.
BirdNote is moving to an earlier time during Here and Now weekday mornings. Starting November 13th, you'll find your favorite waders, raptors, and waterfowls at 9:31 a.m. right here on Alaska Public Media FM 91.1.
Funding for Here and Now comes from the listeners of WBUR Boston and Rhodes Scholar, a not-for-profit educational travel organization offering adventures for adults in more than 100 countries. Learn more at roadscholar.org/explore. And Landmark College, offering online dual enrollment courses for neurodiverse high school juniors and seniors to earn college credits and prepare for the transition to college. More at landmark.edu/online.
NPR and WBUR. Scott Tong in Washington, D.C.
I'm Peter O'Dowd in Phoenix.
And I'm Deepa Fernandez in Alameda, California. It's Here and Now. Let's take a break from the news and music.
Ay, tubo, kahit muntik, nakalaman doon, ay sari-sari, sa sigarilya sa bataw, bagate.
That's the beautiful sound of the Sampaguitas, a trio that's bringing music from the Philippines to the United States. Much of their music is sung in Tagalog, a language of the Philippines. They just released their first album. It's also called the Sampaguitas. Irene Espiritu, Genevieve Francisco, and Cristina Ibarra are the three women who make up the trio, and Irene Espiritu joins me now. Welcome, Irene, for having me. Irene, congratulations on your album and the song that we just heard. My Home is a children's song. It's actually one that I grew up with, and it's a song about the plant and the vegetables that grow around the garden. And so it names, sikamas, which is sikamas, eggplant, and so it names all these vegetables that grow in the Philippines. And we have the great John Calloway adding flute to the song on the record, which is such a beautiful, playful solo that he adds in there. Can I tell you, I don't speak Tagalog, but I actually pictured, as I was listening to this song, people in a circle holding hands, going around in a circle. That was the picture I had in my head. And I love just adding vegetables to that picture. Yes, isn't that perfect to encourage eating vegetables with children? So that song that we just heard was in Tagalog. There are some songs in English. Tell us why it was important to you to sing in Tagalog. Well, these are the songs that we grew up with and the songs that we're familiar with. And it's a way for us to connect back to our roots. Some of these songs, Christina and Genevieve,
like an island. We welcome them. This music is for them, and we're so happy to share it.
Love it. I want to talk to you about another song on your album. It's called Dahil Sayo. Let's listen. Sa buhay